Good afternoon, everybody. So happy to see so many of you here. So this is going to be a research seminar on experimental policymaking. And I'm Ringa Raudla. So I'm leading and moderating the event. And I will go ahead and share my slides. Then you should be able to see them, hopefully. Great. So in this seminar, we'll present some of the results of our project on experimental policymaking, which lasted for the past 5 years, involved 7 researchers from Tallinn here in Estonia, and was generously funded by the Estonian Research Council grant, for which we are, of course, very, very grateful. And the agenda for the seminar today is as follows. I'll be talking about the politics of experimental policymaking. Johanna will cover the funding aspects. Kerli will discuss experimentation during crises, and Külli will talk about the collaboration and coordination aspects in policy experiments. And the idea is that we'll have presentations followed by short Q&A session, so 5 minutes after each of the topics, and then we'll have a longer discussion at the end once all the presentations are done. So, you may ask, why study experimental policymaking at all? Why are policy experiments interesting? Well, they are interesting because they are viewed as a solution to deal with growing complexity and uncertainty around us. And the basic idea is very simple. If you don't know, or if we don't know whether an idea is going to work, we'll try it out on a small scale for a limited period of time before making it permanent and scaling it up. And in our project, then how do we define experiments? What do we mean under this term? We have adopted a rather broad definition for the purposes of our project, and we define an experiment as a time-limited test of novel policy solution that offers information for further policy decisions. So it does cover randomized controlled trials like the famous universal basic income experiment in Finland, where 2,000 people were randomly chosen from the list of unemployed people, and they were offered the unconditional income of 560 euros a month, and then their behavior and other indicators were tracked for the next 2 years. However, we also cover non-randomized policy pilots and also design experiments and experimental legislation where a law is enacted for a short period of time to assess its effects before it's made permanent. So in this part of the presentation where I talk about the politics of experimentation, we focus on the large-scale policy experiments that include elected officials, and we focus on experiments initiated by government actors rather than experiments taking place in a lab. So what's the research gap we are trying to address here? Well, despite the fact that there is growing academic debate on policy experimentation, there is really very limited systematic knowledge of the politics of experimental policymaking. So what we do with a couple of research papers is to try to advance a bit more systematic understanding of the political motives of experimental policymaking by using 2 different theoretical lenses. First, the clashing timeframes, so the clashes between political timeframes and experimental timeframes, and second, the lens of blame avoidance and credit claiming. And we don't only have a theoretical discussion, we also probe the plausibility of those theoretical ideas with the cases of Finland and Estonia. and ask in those two cases, how have political timeframes influenced experimental policymaking, and how have the motivations of blame avoidance and credit claiming influenced experimental policymaking in these two countries? So first, theoretically, then, how could political timeframes influence experimental policymaking? We identify two different clashes that can happen between the political side and the experimental side. First, the disparities between electoral and experimental timeframes, and second, differences between the political problem cycle timeframes and those of the experiments. So electoral cycle, very familiar to all of you, it is the most important temporal unit in democratic settings. And that in turn strongly influences the time budgets and also the time horizons that politicians have. And that in turn is likely to influence whether policy experiments are initiated at all, how they are designed, and to what extent policymakers learn from them. So just some examples of how those clashes could influence experimental policymaking. Well, it may lead to politicians being reluctant to launch large-scale experiments at all because they want to point to more visible and concrete achievements before elections, and experiments are just too weak of an achievement to tell to the electorate about. Okay, this is what we achieved, please elect us back. Second, the electoral term limits the time budgets of politicians, and so they prefer faster experiments in order to make sure that the results are available before the next election. Also, they may be impatient in waiting for the results and start drawing conclusions from the experiments before the experiment is actually over. And also, once a new government is in after the election, they might be tempted to just ignore the experimental evidence of the experiment launched by the previous government. So, and the other clash is between what we call a problem cycle in experiments. And the essence of the problem cycle is that if there is a societal problem, then politicians are expected to fix it fast. And because the public expects such quick solutions, that shortens the time horizons of the politicians even further, even shorter than the electoral cycles. And in such a context, then gathering evidence via experimentation could be seen as an unaffordable luxury. And the other lens that we use for discussing the political motivations is that of blame avoidance and credit claiming. So how could experiments be used by politicians to generate credit? Well, it's a way to show that they use evidence-based policymaking. It can be used to signal cautiousness in the face of uncertainty, to show that they are trying to avoid large-scale failures, and could be a way to demonstrate steps in solving a problem. On the other hand, experiments can also give rise to blame, which politicians, of course, try to avoid. And what kind of blame could experiments give rise to? Well, when politicians launch an experiment, it means that they admit insufficient knowledge. It means that they don't know what the right thing is. They need to experiment. And they may think that voters don't like that. They want a confident politician who knows what they're doing. Also, experiments may look like postponing the solution of a problem. And of course, they also entail the risk of failure that may then generate blame for wasting public resources and so on. And of course, those may depend on contextual factors, both the blame and the credit in experimental policymaking. We can discuss those factors if those are interesting for you afterwards. So empirically then, what did we find? Or first of all, why did we look at Estonia and Finland in the first place? Why those two countries? Well, we wanted to be countries that have relatively similar political institutions, but have rather different experiences with regard to experimental policymaking. And indeed, Finland has had lots of experiments, lots of different types of experiments so far. including large-scale randomized controlled trials, including the world-famous universal basic income one, but there have been other large RCTs as well in the fields of education and employment policy. Whereas in Estonia, there is some experience with experiments, with pilots, with design experiments, but no large-scale RCTs so far. So how did we collect the data? We conducted semi-structured interviews with 32 officials in Estonia, 34 in Finland in 2022 and 2023, and used Max Kuda to code them all. So what did we find? We did find indeed that the electoral cycles have been relevant in influencing the political motivations around experiments. For example, even though Finland has managed to launch various large-scale reforms, electoral cycle has been considered as an impediment. And in Estonia, what we saw was that the government, since there is a relatively frequent turnover, the average duration of a government is 1 to 2 years, so which means that when politicians get into the office, they don't think they have 4 years to get things done, but rather maybe 1 or 2 years, and are highly reluctant to launch large-scale experiments. In Finland, we also saw that there is a preference to launch experiments at the beginning of the government term to make sure they can be finished before their term is over. There is clear preference for shorter duration, shorter than that scientists or the civil servants involved would prefer. And also we saw some examples of impatience in waiting for the results of the experiment to come in. For example, in Finland, there was an interesting example of the employment services pilot where those services were delegated to the local governments, and the idea was to pilot it first for the 4 years to see how it works. But then after 2 years into the pilot, elections were coming up, and the government just decided to make that decision permanent and scale it up before any of the pilot results were even in. And we also saw that the short problem cycles clearly hamper the use of policy experiments then further. Although in Finland, we also saw that sometimes politicians use the experiments to, so to say, buy time, and they can be a way to show that the politicians are taking first steps in addressing the problem. And when it comes to the blame avoidance and credit claiming angle, we saw in both countries that they really are important motivations to understand what's going on in experimental policymaking. And the attributions of blame and credit, on the other hand, are highly dependent on the context. And a really interesting contrast that emerged from our interviews between Finland and Estonia was that in Finland, experiments primarily are viewed as a source of credit for the politicians, that they're ways to proceed in a cautious way, take steps to address problems, whereas in Estonia, they are primarily viewed as a source of blame. So there is a pressure to innovate without experimenting. And a bit more detailed discussion here than indeed in Finland. It's a way that politicians view experiments as a way to signal caution. And they view it also as a cheap way to launch more initiatives. Politicians can go to TV and say, wow, we launched a new thing here, and it's a lot cheaper to do an experiment than a large-scale reform. And also it's a way to postpone decisions in a way and reach political compromises. Whereas in Estonia, it seems that the experiments on the one hand are too small to generate credit. On the other hand, they're viewed as too risky because they can fail and through that generate blame. And politicians are afraid of being then accused of wasting public resources. And they don't want to admit uncertainty either. However, context matters. So the urgency of the policy problems, the scope of the experiment, the public trust, all influence how the credit and blame accrue. So to conclude then, it is really crucial to look at political motivations if we want to understand experimental policymaking. And the two angles that we offered, theoretical angles, the clashing timeframes and blame avoidance and credit claiming, do offer very useful angles, we think, or the starting points for understanding those motivations. But of course, a lot of work is still ahead in understanding the politics of experimental policymaking. If you're interested in more details, we have published 2 articles so far on the politics aspects of experimental policymaking. If you don't have access to them, feel free to reach out. We'll be happy to share. And thank you once more to the Estonian Research Council. Right, so we can have a short Q&A if you have quick questions about this particular topic, and then we can proceed with the next presentation topic. So are there any questions about the politics part?
Sorry, I can't really like see in the Zoom how I can raise my hand, so I'm just talking maybe. Thank
Go
you.
ahead, Ina, please.
Thank you for the very informative talk. I was just wondering, of course, when we come like to like trying to understand like core dynamics, I absolutely understand, but to have like the politics side and the more experimental or policy making side as the 2 poles you've been now debating. But of course, this all happens in the public admin context. So I was wondering if you also have insights on how the time framing or the perceptions of time framing from the public servants and the actual public organizations might also be influential. And the same, of course, for the blame game, because of course it might, I don't know, differ whether we're talking about an agency doing the experiments or the line organization. And of course, the field is more complex. So I was wondering if this public admin, public servant perspective was also something where you have results on.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the dynamics differ considerably whether we look at the motivations of politicians, the elected officials, whether we look at the civil servants, and also in the civil service, what level we look at. Do we look at the ministry? Do we look at the agency level? We haven't written specific papers about it, but I think it's very clear that civil servants tend to take much longer term perspectives. We heard in the interviews that they were often frustrated with how they have been pressured to do the experiments really quickly and get it up and running in a month. Sometimes like it was in the case of the universal basic income, whereas you need a lot of preparations to actually do it properly. So yeah, the dynamics of, I think the time frames and also the blame and credit considerations would be rather different if we apply the same angle to the civil servants. So, and in a way, the fact that the civil servants are there helps to counterbalance at least a little bit the political short-term pressures. So that has been, I think, one of the reasons why Finland has been able to actually conduct such impressive experiments, because they have such capable civil servants as well. All right, yeah, Jonas.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you very much. But one thing that struck me is, did you assume that experimentation, political experimentation, is something valuable? But is there proof that experimentation is valuable, and under which circumstances would it be valuable? Or value? I mean, are all experimentations are value political, or are there certain experiments which are easier to do? Or
I think overall our stance in our project has been that experiments can be useful if they are designed in a way that allows learning, and also, of course, that are viewed as legitimate by the public and are conducted properly without violating any rights. So they can't. In a way, our starting point was to be relatively agnostic just say, okay, we'll see whether they are good or bad. And what we ended up with was that we saw that they can be useful, but they can also be sometimes abused, perhaps for purposes that were for which they were meant to. So my short answer would be they can be useful if they're well designed, well crafted, and actually used to generate lessons rather than maybe for
The conditions for scaling,
opportunistic motives. Yes. Thank you very much, Celine.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much, Ringa, for bringing us together to discuss about the politics of policy experimentation. I think it's such a valuable and original approach. As you know, I'm currently working on studying a policy experiment on cannabis legalization that is currently done in Switzerland. This is a highly politicized policy area. And I was wondering whether in your experience or observations, or whether you know about literature, do we know something about the difference that's the topics and the policy fields can have on the politicization or on the politics of policy experiments, because we frame our analysis under the framework of morality policies for drug legalization. So I was wondering about cross-field differences.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that that's one of the contextual factors that I pointed out as being important, but then didn't get into in the presentation. And you're absolutely right there. That's sort of how visible, how salient, and how maybe polarized that policy field does influence, but how the political motivations come in here. And our results overall show that experimentation tends to work better in fields that are not so polarized, in a way where there is curiosity across the political spectrum to find out whether things work, but there isn't too much ideological investment in one way or the other. Otherwise, the political dynamics start perhaps overriding the real learning experiences from the experiments. Okay, I'll take the last question from Kalle, and then I propose to go on with the next presentation, but then you can keep your questions in mind for the last half an hour that we have reserved for the discussion. Yeah, Kalle, please.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting presentation. I was thinking about who decided what and how something would become an experiment, because I imagine the outcomes, especially regarding the time aspects, might differ depending on whether the initiative came from the citizen, the politicians, and if so, the majority or the minority, and also if it came from maybe the administration. So who was deciding upon what experiment to actually testing? Could you see some kind of things that were depending regarding the time scale, depending on who was initiating the experiments?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we, in these two papers that we wrote that I just presented, we were primarily interested in the politicians' motivations. So if they initiate or they have a chance to launch them, how would they view it? But of course, the incentives might be very different if it was the civil servants or the citizens or NGOs or researchers. So indeed, this offered only a very, very small angle at the experiments, because in this case, we wanted to understand the politicians' motives, and they were the ones assumed to have some control over whether the experiment gets launched or not. Excellent. Thank you so much for your questions so far. Very, very insightful questions. And we will now proceed with the next topic, which is money, funding. Nothing happens without funding and money. So, and Johanna will talk about the funding of public sector experiments.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ringa. And welcome to everyone and all of the listeners and their AI agents in the Zoom. Very happy to be presenting one of the dimensions that emerged as a very interesting research subject in our project, which is how the funding of public sector experiments influences the policy experimentation. And as you can see, this paper has quite many co-authors, with Ringa being the lead author, and I was very happy to present it at the RSPM conference, and by now it's also published, and I have also reference at the end of the slides. But of course, so the background of this
Johanna, I guess it is not in the presenter mode for some reason. If you could put it
Sorry,
in the mode.
I was sharing, but I will share another way. Okay, share. Do you see it now in the presenter mode?
No, but now we see it. Excellent.
You see it now. Okay, okay, excellent. So why we can see that there are these different types of experiments and then the whole field of aspects that influence it. We were also wondering within it that how does funding influence public sector experimentation? And we draw on the literatures of experimental policymaking, public sector innovation, public budgeting to ask how do different funding solutions influence the incentives and capacities of government organizations to undertake experiments? And here, of course, there are different papers that have touched upon funding a bit. So we see that even in the presence of the mindset and motivation to experiment, we need some certain capacities, and funding can be a way to create these capacities. For example, skills, knowledge, IT technology, time, these essential resources to make experiments happen. When looking at these different approaches to funding, we differentiate between earmarked and hodgepodge funding. So what do they mean? By earmarked funding, we mean that the funding for experiments is explicitly allocated on the government or organization level. So it can be a systemic funding for experimentation in public sector, or it can be allocated on the organization level. It can be a fund for experiments, or just a line in the budget that is meant for experimentation. And it can then be a top-down allocation or a bottom-up from the organization level. So when we analyzed it from the theoretical perspective, we saw that there are certain risks that are associated with the earmarked funding. So more specifically, if you have allocated funding for experimentation with a, for example, experimental fund, it can be easily cut during times of recession. It can be seen as a luxury. So if it shows quite clearly in the budget, it is something that we can put our finger on and say, maybe this is something we shouldn't be spending on. At the same time, the other way to fund experiments is by hodgepodge funding, which means that there is no specifically labeled line items for experimentation in the budget, but we need the resources if the idea emerges and we see that it's needed to do the experiment. And of course, it has certain risks associated with it, that the innovation can be constrained by bureaucracy, there is risk aversion to experimentation or lack of ownership. And of course, we can assume that having the earmarked funding approaches would have some more favorable, would create more favorable conditions of experimentation. So on the organization level, we think that it could jumpstart experiments in the context of not previously experimenting. It can also legitimize experimentation or protect the budget from competing demands. Yeah, and also it creates this predictable environment for experiments that we can rely on that financing. And on the system level, it shows that there is a mandate for experiments on a political level, and also it can be a way to legitimize strategic level experiments. But of course, as I previously said, it's also easy to cut this kind of funding way of experiments. So when we go to the Estonian and Finland cases, as Ringa explained, we did a comparative study based on 66 interviews and also asked our interviewees about funding. So very briefly presenting some of the results, we see that there are very diverging funding trajectories in Finland and in Estonia. In Finland, we see a case for this system level top-down earmarked funding that at the time of Juha Sipilä's government was a way to launch very large-scale strategic experiments. So there was the funding allocated for this, and it also gave some security and certainty that we can go through with these many-year-long experiments. But at the same time, Finland also has seen these bottom-up funds that enable agile small-scale experimentation. So the Finland is a case to show that the domestic earmarking has allowed for flexibility and also creating legitimacy of experiments, which especially the flexibility aspect is very important when we cannot be entirely sure how the experiment will run or if we have to make some changes, while legitimacy creates long-term security. In Estonia, the picture is a bit different. We haven't had strategic level large-scale experiments, so we can draw on the evidence of these bottom-up experiments that have been rather small scale and design focused. We have seen mostly hodgepodge funding, so there has been some kind of process within the organization that has resulted in a need to conduct an experiment, and we will then find funds from the existing budget lines. What is the peculiarity of Estonia is also the high reliance on EU funds. That if anyone has ever worked with the EU-level structural funds, you know that while the budget can be quite large, it also necessitates that you have a very clear plan and also plan to succeed. So that's why the EU funds are mostly associated with pilots or design experiments that have a very clear, tangible outcome. It's not so good to do RCTs, for example, that might have unpredictable outcomes. And while from the experiment perspective, it can be considered a success, it can be not a favorable outcome in terms of the funding requirements. We also see some developments in Estonia. We have the innovation fund that requires experiments as part of the larger public sector innovation projects, and which can bring on new incentives in public sector, and which can lead to more earmarked funding of experiments. But when we compare the two countries, we see that there's a cross-cutting constraint, which is lack of resources in general, which is not just money. So when I jump to our key findings, we can say that even though funding is very important, and we see that it helped a lot in the Finnish case, and has been the way to accelerate the experimental culture in public sector, we also see that it might not be the main constraint of experiments. So there, in both countries, our interviewees mentioned that other types of resources are equally important. Ideas, initiative, people to work on experiments. So that has to be kept in mind, that if we throw money on experimentation, it might not bring the results we expect, because it's not the only factor. But nevertheless, in Finland, we see that the lack of continued earmark funding from the government after the Experimental Finland program ended was crucial in shifting the experimental field. And Estonia, with the hodgepodge funding approach, is still waiting for its more strategic experiments. And if you're more interested in these results, I invite you to read the full article that's now already published quite freshly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for the presentation. So any questions about the funding aspects? Yes, Lauma, please.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for such an interesting presentations already so far. I have some questions regarding the experimentation aspect in EU-funded projects because, well, in Latvia we have a very similar situation in being way too dependent on EU structural funds. And in my experience so far, this funding source really hampers any kind of experimentation. The only experimentation that I would say is possible is when it comes to larger scale, like program level funding types. I mean, instead of just simple projects, but projects like we have, for example, a postdoc program, which is ironically not a national level program, but it's funded by the EU funds. So this kind of large scale programs where there are different levels of sub-funding, then you can start introducing different kind of experimentations because you have a bit longer time frame and rather fixed funds that are not really that tied to the electoral cycle, I would say. They still are, but they are more tied to individual organizations implementing these programs and the key performance indicators that are being set up for the specific programs. But have you found, are there any more kind of like lessons or maybe tips or I don't know what to get, different kind of yes, valuable lessons that you have learned, particularly when it comes to EU-funded experimentation? Like, are there any evidence of when this kind of experimentation succeeds better, or when it's possible, or how does it differ for both countries? In any case, I would be very interested in this.
Yeah, excellent points. I mean, actually, in Finland, almost all our interviewees said that when it comes to experimentation, they try to avoid the use of EU funds because of the rigidities involved. And in the Estonian case, we also heard that, yeah, well, the EU funding expects us to come up with a prototype or a solution, and it's supposed to be in place for the next 5 years, whether it works or not. So, I mean, this is very clearly going against it. But what's a really positive development is the innovation fund we currently have in Estonia. Johanna mentioned it as well, where they have written into the rules of operation that 40% of the projects that get funded may fail. So it's already negotiated with a commission because it is an innovation fund for innovation projects, and that they demand experimentation as part of it. So I'd see it as a positive development. Also, the awareness in the EU that experimentation entails uncertainty, and we cannot promise a result if we don't know how the experiment is going to work out. Yeah, Johanna, do you want to add anything?
No, but I see that Steven also has a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Based on your interviews, so how open would you say those current funders of experiments are towards having experiments co-funded by other stakeholders? So I understand that most of experiments are funded directly through a fund or through a central government, but often they also involve other levels of government, or they involve perhaps private actors. So would you say there's an openness to combine funds, or would you say that they rather prefer to do it on their own? And to what extent have you seen examples where, for instance, other funding mechanisms like social impact bonds or whatever are being used, or is this really one government funding one experiment?
Yeah, the idea of the Finnish platform, the Kokeilun paikka, which was to bring together funders, experimenters, and also those who were interested in experimental results. I mean, I think it was a brilliant idea of trying to combine different funding sources. That was the idea, that also the private sector can contribute different levels of the public sector. However, as it turned out, unfortunately, once the central government support was discontinued, it was not viable anymore as a platform. So there was definitely openness to it, but unfortunately, it didn't turn out to be sustainable. But at least as an experiment, I think it was worth trying, and perhaps worth replicating or trying again in the future.
Thanks.
Great. Then we will move on to the next topic, which is crises. So experimentation during crisis, and Kerli will talk about that.
Yes, hello. I'm just trying to share my screen. Could you let me know if you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello, everyone. My pleasure to talk to you about one of the topics in this project, experimenting during crisis. So our team of 5 tried to understand how do crisis conditions influence launching experiments. And for the introduction, as soon as I can go to the next slide. Yep. I just brought the definition, what we consider experiments to be, to refer back to Ringa's presentation, where she already defined the experiments that are time-limited tests that are undertaken by government organizations to learn about the impacts of a new policy solution, which can be used as evidence for further policy decisions. So we approach in a rather broad way, but the bottom line is that experiments are set up with intention to learn, and this sets them apart from this kind of freewheeling trial and error, or activities that are based on gut feeling of civil servants or politicians. And so when we talk about experiments, we don't strictly mean randomized controlled trials, but we discuss other experiments as well, such as pilot projects and design experiments. Pilot projects being solutions that are first tested on a smaller scale or a target group, and after the desired results emerge, the solution is fully scaled. And the design experiments where you test and refine the solution until desired results emerge. Therefore, in design experiments or in design thinking, the target groups are already included in the creation process. So our broader research question is, how do crises influence experimentation? So we figured out in the very beginning that the conditions of crisis and the logics of experimentation, they create paradoxes. Like they are somewhat contradictory. And just a short and superficial insight into our theoretical approach. Crisis conditions bring about uncertainty and problems that are urgent and unexpected. And some authors have proposed that to manage during crises, governments need to develop robust solutions. Solutions that would not only help to survive crisis and build resilience, but also bounce forward, meaning that to become better than we were before the crisis. And experimentation is seen as one strategy or one means to develop those robust solutions. But as of today, we don't actually know how well experimentation could be practiced in crisis conditions. And here we reach the governance of paradoxes, because these paradoxes that are faced, they need to be managed, and with them, well, governments need to cope with. So there is a growing need for abilities to govern those paradoxes, right? So in this paper that is being written at the moment, we outline 4 paradoxes. First one being conflicting timeframes. So crises create urgency, but experimentation takes time. And when conducting experiments, governments learn, they analyze the results, they adapt their approaches if necessary, And during crisis, you don't have time for such luxury. And the realization of full potential of experiments, such as exploration of causality when it comes to RCTs, or exploration of full impact of intervention when talking about any type of experiment, they may take months and sometimes even years. And this creates a temptation sometimes to do things faster, for example, avoid some steps of experimental process or be satisfied with superficial results or conclusions. And to illustrate these paradoxes, I present you some quotes from our interviews. And the first one indicates that these kind of real experiments are not used during crisis. However, some elements of experiments are often used as they help to understand whether the solution is working or not, because this is a very, very crucial information during the time. And the second interview points out that the crisis policymaking happens within hours and days rather than months and years, which makes it challenging to conduct experiments during crisis. So the second paradox is related to tolerance of failure, or more specifically, intolerance of failure. As we already discussed, that during crisis, stakeholders expect working solutions on the first try, usually, while experiments entail learning from failure. And during crisis, when the stakes are high, it's even more relevant. So civil servants perceive higher pressure to get things right. And this could lead to immediate implementation of the solution instead of taking time to learn and gain additional knowledge. However, the immediate implementation of the solution, paradoxically, I would say, is risky as well, as the impact of intervention is difficult to estimate in rapidly changing crisis conditions. And experiments help to reach decisions, especially when there is a condition of lack of information. So during crisis, leaders are expected to act with confidence and in a way are expected to know it all. So this creates a paradox. And here, our first interview points out that failure is not tolerated during crisis. And the other one implies that leaders are expected to provide working solutions because they want a sure thing. All stakeholders want a sure thing. So the third paradox is, of course, lack of resources. And just thinking back to Johanna's presentation, experimentation requires resources that are scarce during the crisis, and this may not include financial resources necessarily. But rather, it's everything to do with people and their capabilities, such as lack of cognitive space or time resources. And as one interviewee said, that if you're too much in the red, then you won't have the mental capacity to say like, hey, sure, go on and innovate, come up with something that might be good for us. And this is usually not the crisis mindset, and as seen on the quote on the right. And the other one shows that dirty versions of experiments could be applied during crisis, and the money is not usually the biggest problem when experimenting in crisis conditions. And the fourth paradox is the limitations of scalability. So it is widely acknowledged that the crisis create a window of opportunity to do something different, or they reveal weaknesses in existing processes or structures. However, creating a long-lasting change has been rather questioned. So temporality of crisis may challenge the wider use of the results of experiments. And we had some interviewees who didn't have a lot of faith in the survival of these solutions that were developed during the crisis or in crisis conditions. One interviewee said that experimentation requires normal conditions, as you cannot get good information for normal times during the crisis. And both of these actually illustrate the doubts that the solutions developed in crisis conditions actually may not survive the crisis, I would say. So we argue that that crises call for experiments that are continuously and intensely interact with the surroundings. and so that they are able to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. And so the pilot projects and design experiments are able to do that better than RCTs. And the RCTs have their strengths due to being methodologically a very strong approach. They provide validity of results and therefore confidence in the impacts of the solution. However, they are very time-consuming method as well, and RCTs could be very rigid. Like if you decide in the middle of an experiment that your approach is flawed, or for example, when the problem changes or you need to consider an additional sample in your solution, you must start over. By contrast, it is much easier to evaluate the success of pilot projects and therefore to decide whether the solution is ready to be scaled. However, it still may be tempting to save time by reducing time devoted to testing and gathering feedback. And when conducting design experiments, co-creation reduces the likelihood of failure. Target groups are partners in design experiments, and this requires a strong leadership and deep insights into the experiences of service users or citizens. And while they are quite flexible, it's not very easy to conduct a design experiment, as it presupposes balancing different interests, for example. And it is mentally a very challenging design, as it requires a lot of communication, collaboration, coordination. Giving a short introduction to our next presentation, which all require cognitive resources that are scarce during the crisis. So in conclusion, crisis conditions may lead to the distorted versions of experiments. Right? RCTs are usually not used during crisis. If so, they're not as a gold standard. And experiments during crisis tend to be more generative in their nature, like pilot projects, design experiments that are able to adapt to changing conditions and according to feedback, and therefore reduce the likelihood of failure and are more flexible. So that's it for me. Thank you. If you have any questions, then I would gladly answer them.
Thank you so much, Kerli. So any questions about the crisis aspects of experimentation? I guess it was all really clear. Excellent. We can definitely discuss the crisis aspects also be after the last presentation, when we have a joint discussion of all the topics. So then we can move on to the next topic, next angle, and Professor Külli Sarapuu will be presenting on the collaboration and coordination of experimental policymaking, policy experimentation.
Yes, thank you so much. I will try to share my slides, and then we can take the very last topic for today's seminar. Okay, so do you see the slides of my presentation?
Yes, but not the presentation mode. Reason.
Okay. How is it now?
Yes, excellent.
Yes. Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. So I will present. I will be the last presenter, but hopefully not the least. And I will open yet another perspective on policy experiments that we have applied when we have focused on dissecting the governance of policy experiments. And this focus has been on collaboration and coordination in policy experiments. And when going through the existing knowledge on policy experiments, what we noticed is that the existing studies note that stakeholder coordination and collaboration is really important for the success of experiments. So there are several elements that are included in that. There is the need to identify the crucial institutions and individuals, to assure their contribution, to build joint understanding around experiments, to make joint decisions on design and evaluation, to pool financial and non-financial resources, to share data and expertise. And success in doing all of this has very strong implications for experimental learning, for scaling up the experiments, and ultimately for policy change. However, quite interestingly, this coordination and collaboration perspective hasn't really been in the focus of research in the experimental setting this far. So mostly it has appeared as a side note to studies with other focus, or in the discussion of studies on some other aspects of experimenting. And there are a few studies that specifically focus on collaboration and coordination in experimental setting. And interestingly enough, these are written by researchers who discuss their experience of collaborating with policy practitioners in conducting experiments and giving recommendations how to best work with practitioners when you as a researcher want to conduct experiments in collaboration with policy practitioners. So what we do in our research, and this is work in progress. So there is already a paper on this aspect, but it has not been published yet as an article. So we are working on that. What we do is that we focus on policy experiments specifically from the perspective of collaboration and coordination. And we apply the lens of coordination on understanding how experiments are governed, how they work. And this discussion of coordination is very much rooted and related to the discussion on complex policy problems. As we see, experiments are deemed the most useful in finding novel policy solutions and testing novel policy solutions for complex policy problems. What are the key characteristics of complex policy problems? There are diverse stakeholders with different values and interests. These are problems that cross organizational, political, and jurisdictional boundaries, and there is high uncertainty related to these policy problems, where experiments are considered to be the most promising. What it means is that actually these same elements of complexity, diverse stakeholders, values, interests that cross organizational boundaries are something that need to be that the experimenters are facing themselves and that need to be addressed in the experimental process, and it implies need for coordination between the stakeholders. What is coordination? We rely on definition of coordination as harmonization of duties and actions of different actors to achieve a specific goal. And in dissecting the collaboration and coordination issues in experimental setting, we rely on the differentiation between three basic coordination mechanisms for stakeholder alignment, the classical division of coordination mechanisms into hierarchy, market, and networks. And these three different coordination mechanisms rely on different incentives and resources for achieving coordination. So the aim has been to analyze policy experiments as multi-actor collaborative endeavors where different actors must be brought together for joint work. And our research questions: how has the need to coordinate multiple stakeholders manifested in experimental policy making in Estonia and Finland? How has the usage of different coordination mechanisms influenced experimental policy making according to the perception of our interviewees? And what lessons does the coordination perspective offer for the design and implementation of policy experiments? So the three basic coordination mechanisms that we use as a lens to to analyze and to structure our analysis of the perceptions and experience of our interviewees. So first, hierarchy type coordination. It is coordination that relies on authority, so decision-making power. There is a counterpart that has a decision-making power to mandate an experiment. It can be parliament, it can be government, it can be a top-level leader. So somebody who has authority in the system to mandate an experiment, to oblige the stakeholders to collaborate, to allocate resources for carrying out an experiment, and to scale it up. So usually it appears as a mandate, for example, to carry out an experiment together with the decision to allocate resources. What we also see from the existing studies is that the same authority to make decisions that relate to the policy design or implementation, that also implies multiple veto points within administrative systems, rigidity, and when the experiments are imposed with a authoritative decision, it may also come with a limited legitimacy and ownership of an experiment. Secondly, market type coordination that relies on supply and demand, basically that relies on incentives for the stakeholders to participate in experiments. In the experimental setting, it mostly manifests in the form of different contracts to engage external expertise, external stakeholders, but also, sorry for that, just recovering from autumn cold, and financial incentives to experiment, different funding, tax breaks, subsidies. What always comes with market type coordination is that the stakeholders who are coordinated through market type incentives, their interest in participate in the experiment may be limited by profitability considerations. Also, what comes out from existing studies that actually the public sector efficiency agenda is cutting the slack and resources that are needed for experiments. And also there is rigidity may come with contracts. Finally, network type coordination. So when there are no hierarchical decision or market type incentives that coordinate and bring the actors together, but it's mission-based collaboration, trust, legitimacy, understanding of joint aims. And it manifests in joint decision-making, synergy of knowledge, learning, so really the collaborative advantage. But also what we know and we see also in experimental setting, it puts extensive demands on time and resources. It's very vulnerable to lacking motivation, needs really good management, and can end up in collaborative inertia. And of course, in practice, these coordination mechanisms usually combine, but they provide a useful lens to dissect what kind of basic coordination mechanisms and instruments are in action. And what we found, what we saw that all these three basic coordination mechanisms were represented in the interviewee's perception of collaboration experimental setting, and all of them were simultaneously in action. And also compared to the existing research, why it is interesting is that when we look at the discussion of collaboration and coordination in experimental setting, there is a lot of emphasis on network type coordination, but we see that actually hierarchical coordination has a very important place in public sector and in experimenting within the public sector. What was really interesting for us, and is interesting also in terms of generalized knowledge, is that that despite the same interview protocol, rather different picture emerged in Finland and Estonia. So when talking to the Finnish interviewees, the general picture that emerged was that there was a lot of emphasis on collaborative approach and network type coordination. So giving importance of working across organizational and sectoral boundaries, and several of our interviews said that this is the way how we work in Finland. The hierarchical mandate was emphasized and deemed important, especially, for example, the mandate given by government to implement large strategic experiments, but also it was brought out that the details were left to the implementers. And market type coordination was mentioned occasionally, but it was not in the center of these experiences. In Estonia, the interviewees discussed network type collaboration mostly from the perspective of intra-organizational collaboration. So the focus was very much on how things are solved and how to make experiments work within the organization. And what was different from the Finnish case was that there was a lot of emphasis also on hierarchical mandate, but it was rather not on the level of government, but rather on the level of higher level for the need of higher level managers to mandate the experiment so that it could take place. And what was the perhaps starkest difference between Estonia and Finland was that in Estonia there was very strong emphasis on market type coordination in experimental settings through procurement and contracting out. And it was related to the limited capacities and competencies within public organizations, so that when we asked about coordination in experiments and the management of experiments, then the interviews usually started their answer with the need to conduct the public procurement, and they very much approached the management issues of experiments through public procurement perspective. So generalizations, what we can say is that these basic coordination mechanisms really offer the useful lens for understanding how coordination and collaboration works in experimental settings, and that there is a really multifaceted web of coordination relationship at work. And besides network type coordination, that has been more studied and more sort of acknowledged in experimental literature, actually in the public sector context, there is a very strong role for hierarchy and market also in experimental settings. What we clearly saw was that in experimenting the public sector, the experimenting sort of takes place in the shadow of hierarchy. So also all kinds of network type collaboration is always, as said, in the shadow of hierarchy. And there are potential tensions between the hierarchical mandate and the motivation and the ownership of experiments. Also, the market type coordination is quite widespread, especially in the Estonian case. And it also came out how this importance for contracting out and public procurement comes with two types of problems. One is that when the expertise is bought in, then actually the competencies do not accumulate within organizations. And secondly, that the rigidities of contracting do not go very well with the trial and error nature of experimenting. And finally, to conclude, of course, it's unavoidable. We have to ask how we can explain the differences between Estonia and Finland, and what are the implications of that explanation. And it seems that the differences in the perceptions, they do not relate only to the different experience with experimenting, because in Finland there is quite a lot of experience with experimenting and also with large-scale strategic experiments that could explain some of these differences. But there seems to be also quite a large room for different administrative culture and governance models in the two countries. And so as a provocation or as a last question, we can ask whether, for example, the small experience of Estonia with experimentation is independent or dependent variable, because in a system that is very resource constrained and relies a lot on contracting out and market type coordination, we can ask whether this is a very good experiment, whether it is a facilitating environment for developing experimenting. And I had a few quotes here to illustrate, but as my time is up, I will conclude here. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Külli. So we can proceed with your questions now. You can ask about the coordination and collaboration aspects, but also about all the other topics that we have presented on, or any other questions you may have about experimental policymaking. We've been dissecting it from all kinds of different angles, so we have also thoughts on other aspects. Yeah, Sreya, please.
Thank you, Ringa, for sharing about this project, and it's kind of very good work and so many different aspects. My question was on so all these projects were done by the central government, but was there a difference between, say, the number of collaborators that was there in, say, if there are, did you notice any variation in, say, if there are many collaborators, say the government and many stakeholders, or government just working with, say, the state so if the experiment was only limited to the government being the major stakeholder versus others? And I was trying to link it to the credit and blame literature, that if there are more actors, are governments more okay with sort of the risk gets spread and they are not seen as the only actor? And are they more conscious if they are the only? Did you see any variation like that?
Oh, yeah, perfect. I mean, that would be another really interesting angle for looking at the blame avoidance credit claiming, because, I mean, theoretically, the more actors there are, the more the blame can be spread. But of course, then you have to spread the credit as well. So, I mean, of course, the differences between Estonia and Finland are that Finland had this really large-scale experiments, which meant that there are several public sector organizations and also researchers had to work together. So I think Finland has had much more experience with coordinating really complex large projects. So Külli, did you want to add here anything as well to that question?
Yes. Also, it perhaps gets back to another question that was asked before, and how it relates to the fact that who initiated the experiments. What we saw was that in Finland, the interviews brought, because we specifically asked who initiated the experiments that they had experience with, and there were different stakeholders who had initiated it. Were both the civil servants, it was government level, it was civil society organizations who had pushed for certain experiments. In some cases, it was opposition and discussions in the parliament that were sort of, the pressure was solved or mediated by initiating an experiment. In the Estonian case, the experiments were mostly initiated by civil servants. But in both cases, regardless of where the idea for the experiment and the pressure for experiment came, in the end, it was usually the model was so that there was a public agency or a ministry that was responsible for conducting the experiment. So in that sense, still in any case, there was an organization or agency who could be in the center of blaming. and in case it was a ministry, then it meant also that there was a political level leader who could be in the center of blaming.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the focus of our research was on the central government level, so that was our main interest. But we could see in Finland was that especially during the 2015-2019 Prime Minister Sipilä government, the idea was to promote and facilitate experimentation across the government, the society, to really promote this experimental mindset, whether we talk about central government organizations, whether we talk about local governments, whether we talk about hospitals, or whatever the unit was, they really tried to instill that kind of mindset throughout the society in a way. So, of course, there's a lot more research to be done to try to capture how well that worked on other levels. So we did focus on the central government level in our project.
If I may add, also in few cases when the local governments were engaged in an experiment, then often they were sort of obliged to participate. So it was an experiment initiated by government, but legitimated with a specific regulation in the parliament, and didn't give the opportunity for the local governments not to participate. And even when they were not satisfied, or there were certain criticism on the experiment, then also the local self-governments could shift the blame, because they said they were not responsible for this decision.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yes, so certainly it's a lot more to study, Sreya. So it's a very, very, very pertinent question. So any other questions, queries, reflections, reactions? I do not see any. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining the seminar today, for your questions. And if you're interested in any of our research, please reach out. We'll be happy to share our results. And yeah, so hope to see you at some other venue and discuss further the experimental policymaking topic. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you very much.